Hello, and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the UCF Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. In today's event, Dr. Katie Shilton will discuss data privacy and how our perceptions and policies need to adapt in the age of artificial intelligence. Before we introduce Dr. Shilton, I'd like to say a few words about our speaker series and how you can participate. Let me just turn the screen back on, if I can find the controls, and share some information with you. This is always the fun part of these presentations, is running it. Ethically Speaking is organized by the UCF Center for Ethics with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who's Associate Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture and founding director of the Center for Ethics. We developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time. We encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. We'd also like to hear your feedback and your ideas for future talks in Ethically Speaking. Ethics connects to every facet of our professional and personal lives, and the importance of ethics at UCF is clear from the long list of inaugural partners who helped launch this series. All of us in the partnership hope you enjoy discussions in Ethically Speaking, and we hope it cultivates understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when there are competing values. Today's presentation is being recorded, and we'll post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with others. And at the end of the presentation, Dr. Shilton will take questions moderated by Dr. Beaver. Submit your questions during the talk directly to Dr. Beaver via chat. And if we have time for your question, he'll invite you to unmute and pose your question directly. So now if we can work all the buttons here, I'll turn it over to Dr. Beaver, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Dr. Kubler, and thanks to everybody for being here. It's so lovely to see such a good number of names and such a friendly number of faces, too. I'm really grateful for Dr. Shilton for being here and pleased to introduce her. Dr. Shilton is the Associate Professor in the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. In that role, she does many things, including co-directing the program, I think a new program in BS in Social Data Science, and she leads the Ethics and Values and Design Lab. She also holds affiliations with other institutes across her campus, including Center for Archival Futures and the Social Data Science Center. Dr. Shilton received her PhD from UCLA in Information Studies after earning a Master of Library and Information Science degree from that same institution. She's been funded regularly by the National Science Foundation, including a prestigious Career Award and several awards from the NSF's Ethics Initiative programs for both single institution and collaborative research projects. Those projects and the numerous publications that have developed from them focus Dr. Shilton's work on intersections among ethics and policy for information technologies, including areas like privacy-sensitive searching and ethical cultures in computer science and tools for facilitating ethics discussions in those areas. These intersections that Dr. Shilton is going to discuss with us today and is a leader in nationally are among cybersecurity, data science, and technology ethics. These, of course, have become significant and have significant implications right now in the era of big data. And when we're talking about the era of big data, we're using the idea of AI tools here as one bit of a very lively conversation that's happening right now. So many of the conversations that we're having today at UCF and in our broader communities line up towards these same issues. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Shilton for sharing her expertise with us today in her talk titled Data Ethics in the AI Age, Principles for Trustworthy Data Reuse. So please join me in welcoming digitally Dr. Shilton.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be joining you virtually today. So today I'm going to focus on how data scientists and AI researchers might support increased public trust in research that uses and relies on rich information that is generated about people through digital devices and digital interactions, what we often call big data. and but specifically big data about people and their interactions online. And I want to start first with an acknowledgement. This work is really a team effort. I've been working with teams my entire career, but particularly the Pervade project, and I'll talk more about that team in a few minutes. And in particular, my collaborator, Emmanuel Moss, he is an anthropologist who was critical to shaping sections of this talk. You'll see there's some anthropological themes here, and Manny was a big part of those. And we've sometimes given a version of this talk together. So I want to just acknowledge sort of his co-thinking on all of this. And I have contact information for him as well at the end of the talk. He's now at Intel Research. All right, I'm going to start by talking about what I mean when I talk about data use and data reuse, particularly in artificial intelligence, and why I think there are massive trust problems in this area. I'm going to talk a bit more about why existing infrastructure that we've built for public trust in research ethics and in data use ethics, the Belmont report and its facilitation by university IRBs, creates a helpful, but I'm going to argue fairly orthogonal infrastructure for guiding research and development that relies on large collections of data. And then I'm going to talk about another discipline that has struggled with a mismatch between existing research ethics infrastructures and the data that they are dealing with, which is that of anthropology and specifically ethnography. And I'm going to talk about the parallels between ethnography and digital data use and digital data research, parallels that have a lot to do with that mismatch to our current research ethics governance infrastructure. And then I'm going to talk about how I think those parallels can help us think through interventions that can help support trustworthy data use for science and also for AI, based on excavating two things that are too frequently paved over in AI research. First is people's awareness of data use and reuse, and the second is attention to power relationships. Okay, so I may or may not, I don't think actually, there are no audiences today that I talk to that I have to tell that digital data has become a gold mine for research and for development. It's fairly evident to the degree to which people's digital traces are being used for both new knowledge discovery and also to make products. And so, we use digital data to understand people as well as to train systems to make predictions or decisions for and about people. And you may also be aware that that developers and scientists are both grappling with the fact that new data collection methods have also raised new questions of ethics and participation in this kind of both research and development. So some of you who have been following this issue longer may remember the furor set off in 2014, which seems like an age ago, but in 2014 by Facebook's emotional contagion study, which was conducted with Cornell University researchers. And there was a study that experimented on Facebook users to sort of understand if changing their news feed would, the emotional valence of their news feed would change the emotional valence of their posts. And so Facebook ran an experiment on many users without their explicit consent. And people were very angry about it at the time. They felt experimented on and unhappy about it. And one of my colleagues, Casey Fiesler, did an analysis of backlash to that study using public comments on media articles about the study. And what they found were pretty fundamental disagreements about what Facebook is and what a user's relationship to it should be, so about the platform in general. And in particular, Facebook users objected to the feeling of living in a lab, of being observed for study while they go about their daily lives online. But this mistrust of research uses of data, of online data, is broader than just Facebook. I mean, there's a lot of mistrust in Facebook built into this backlash as well, but it's broader than Facebook. A study of Twitter users back when it was Twitter, pre-X, found that a majority, this was conducted by Fiesler and Preferis, found that the majority of users were surprised that their tweets are used in research and feel that informed consent should be necessary. Now, if you are a social media researcher, this might be a surprising finding because social tweets are used they're still called tweets, I think, are used all the time in research. Less now that the platform is going through so many problems, but for a long time, Twitter was the model organism of social media research because tweets are accessible. They're public, they're accessible, and they were used all the time in research. Turns out Twitter users did not know this. And so respondents expressed in that survey expressed willingness to participate in research, but it depended on the purpose, the institution, and the mechanics of that research. A much more recent survey of over 1,000 social media users by Libby Hemphill and colleagues showed that participants find social media data to be moderately sensitive and deserving of similar protection to medical records. And finally, and I think this is important, studies indicate that trust issues in data reuse from digital platforms and for research purposes may be even larger in marginalized communities. And importantly, this research backlash is occurring at the same time as a more general backlash against the platforms that create the data that are at the heart of much data science and much AI development. So much of the data that's used in big data research and development was commercial data first, streaming from platforms and smart devices and other online interactions. And increasing research uses of such data have coincided with the growth in news headlines and podcast episodes and a major motion picture, or it's really a Netflix documentary, about what are increasingly viewed as the ethical failings of big tech. And the tech industry has struggled with whether and how to talk about its politics, its values, and its social obligations, and its role in controlling increasingly pervasive data about all of us. So this leaves researchers in a bit of a bind. What should people who rely on digital data to do their research or to make new tools do in the face of this kind of mistrust and uncertainty of digital data use? So with colleagues for the past, I think, 7 years now, I've been part of the Pervade project, which originally started as a 5-year grant-funded project, but then, COVID. So it was more like 7 years to study empirical questions in data ethics. And at the heart of our project were questions of trust in data use. What are trustworthy uses and reuses of online digital data? And what we saw when we started looking at these questions, this was 2016-ish, was that most of the solutions that were on the table at that time were reliant on approaches that had already been developed for doing traditional research ethics, but weren't sufficient for the emerging paradigm of doing research with big digital data sets. So for example, as part of the Pervade project, we've conducted surveys of American digital platform users to try to understand the factors that matter to them about the acceptability of digital data collection and reuse. With my colleagues Sarah Gilbert, Jessica Vitak, we use something called factorial vignette surveys. And those are surveys where you give people little stories, like paragraph-long stories. You can see one over on the right there. And you systematically change the factors in those stories to assess acceptability of research and data use on contrasting platforms. We study Facebook, dating apps, Instagram, and Reddit. And what we found on a series of studies and a series of papers was that there were different expectations between platforms depending on the research domain, the purpose of the research, and the content collected. The acceptability of digital data research and digital data reuse depended on the context, both the type of information and the platform it was collected from, but also who was asking and why. And this was not a surprise to us. This matches both common sense as well as what is predicted by privacy theorists. A lot of privacy theory right now is really focused on this idea of context and contextual norms, and this matched what we expected. But this "it depends" finding it matters because it places the onus for determining appropriate collection and uses of data on the people using that data, on researchers or on developers of AI systems. Although there was one consistent clue across platforms that can help researchers and developers, and it's the place we're kind of starting with our recommendations, which is that the factor with the greatest impact across all platforms and all data types was consent and awareness of data collection and use. This also was not a surprise to us, and if you work in research ethics, may not be a surprise to you. American research ethics, since the time of the Belmont Report, has been dominated by procedures that rely on in-person research contexts. a research communication relationship that assumes a one-on-one ability to get consent from participants and then debrief them afterwards as necessary. It relies on the assumption that researchers can appropriately predict the risks and balance them with benefits in their research context. And it relies on the assumption that vulnerable populations are limited to distinct groups with lessened autonomy. Children or prisoners are examples in traditional research ethics. So it makes sense that American platform users, when they're asked about research uses of data, rely on assumptions of protections that US users have grown used to. The problem is that digital research can break these assumptions. A standard toolkit for making decisions about traditional experimental research, informed consent forms, data de-identification, consideration of sort of narrowly scoped vulnerable populations are not completely protective for digital data use or reuse. Some kind of new toolkit is needed. And when we started thinking as a team about the uneasy fit between digital data research and IRB protections, it reminded us of another field that has similarly grappled with an uneasy fit between the assumptions behind the Belmont and the Common Rule and their practices in the field, that of ethnography. And so I'm going to argue that digital data use has more in common with ethnography than is sort of immediately obvious. The instruments are different: human senses instead of digital sensors, individual sense making instead of algorithmic pattern matching. But both forms of research rely on integration and interpretation of multiple data streams. Both require judgment about what features of a context are relevant for meaning making. And the ethical challenges resonate between these methods as well. In a classic ethnographic methods textbook, Spradley writes, "No matter how unobtrusive, ethnographic research always pries into the lives of informants. Participant observation represents a powerful tool for invading other people's way of life. It reveals information that can be used to affirm their rights, interests, and sensitivities, or to violate them." And substitute the words digital data use or data science or AI, and I think the concern is the same. Reflecting first and foremost on whether data use will affirm the rights, interests, and sensitivities of the people that it documents, or alternatively violate those interests, should be a first order concern for trustworthy digital data use. Ethnographers' dedication to the rights and interests of the subjects of participant observation comes from a long and painful history of the use of ethnographic methods. The history of ethnographic research is also one of colonialism. The earliest ethnographies were conducted by American and European academics through fieldwork among indigenous peoples, and this practice continued well into the 1980s. As post-colonial movements took hold in academia, and particularly in anthropology, scholars began to grapple with the ethics of their work, and a recentering of the rights of and obligations to research subjects was the result of a field-wide reckoning. So today, ethnographers are expected to explicitly reflect on their power as researchers, as well as on what they are taking from the communities that they study. Ethical concerns about early ethnographies are not limited to colonialism, but also extended to other historically disenfranchised groups. One of the most famous examples of controversy over ethical issues in ethnography surrounded Loud Humphrey's 1968 dissertation and his later book titled Tea Room Trade: Impersonal Sex in Public Places. In this study, Humphreys conducted observations of male-male sexual encounters in public restrooms known as tea rooms. Humphreys disguised his identity and his purpose as a researcher. He did not obtain consent from participants, and he used license plate numbers to discover the identities of the otherwise anonymous men from the restrooms, sort of an early big data collection. You can think about it that way. And the ethics of tea room trade caused an uproar at the time and are still debated within sociology. So data science and AI research may not be as obviously entangled with colonialism as anthropology, although there are scholars who are arguing that it absolutely is. But I want to highlight today that we do use tools and methods entangled with other problematic practices. Data that's been biased by historical injustices, and data collected frequently without participant awareness in the name of surveillance and commercial interests, rather than the direct interests of data subjects. And that data is then repurposed for reasons beyond what participants may have consented to or understood. So if digital data use is to be trustworthy, we need to explicitly grapple with the fact that our data and our methods are also used for surveillance and control. So I think that ethnographers' reflections on awareness of their research subjects and their power relationships with research sites are really inspiring and can inspire some principles for big data reuse as well. Along with the Pervade research team, I've argued that researchers using pervasive data of various sorts need to probe both the appropriateness and the complex potential harms of that data using two lenses that are directly inspired by ethnographers and ethnographic research. First, data scientists can learn from ethnographers' contextual sensitivity and experience helping research subjects interpret research participation by reflecting on awareness. Ethnographers have developed a suite of techniques to gain the trust of their participants. First, they must gain what is called entree, which is the permission of participants to be in their spaces and their lives. Then ethnographers frequently encourage research participants to read parts or all of their analysis using techniques like participant checking to check the validity of their observations and findings. Some ethnographic traditions move beyond entree and participant checking to collaborative ethnography, which involves people in the creation of research goals, data collection, analysis, authorship, and dissemination. So data scientists, I think, and AI developers can also really learn from ethnographers' reflection on power. Ethnographers are dealing with a legacy of distrust of their methods due to its relationship with colonialism. Data scientists are dealing with a legacy of distrust due to the use of our tools for pervasive surveillance. We are bound up in the techlash as well. So over time, ethnographers made serious efforts to diversify the discipline and shifted topics of study within the discipline by including studying up, which is performing ethnographic research on groups that are more or at least equally, rather than less socially powerful than the researcher or the research team. So what might analogous reflections on awareness and power look like in research using digital data about people? To think about first what awareness in particular looks like in data science, we found it helpful to start from the data itself by mapping data collected from digital devices and interactions on two spectra. This is a heuristic for thinking about where data come from that can help reason about what people's reasonable expectations about what will be done with it. So first, people's data gets collected somewhere along the continuum of private to public. And I want to say, I don't mean these words to mean actually private or actually public. These are people's perception of the publicness or privateness of their data. There's some arguments that no data really should be, almost all digital data is public in some way or somebody else has access to it. And that is true, but we're talking about people's understanding or perception of the privateness or publicness of their data. So private data might get collected with an explicit or implicit expectation of privacy, especially for things like medical records or financial documents. And yet, as I said, this private information might wind up in data sets used in one research purpose for another. It is not actually private, but people perceive it as private, and we think that's important. Public information gets collected for research all the time as well. Twitter feeds, census data, likes on a YouTube video are all data created for a public audience. Second, data can be more or less intentionally created. Again, I want to emphasize this is intentional on the part of the person creating the data. Somebody intends for you to create all data, but it's the user's intention that I'm focusing on here. So when I press send on a tweet, I know that I'm intending to put something out there into the world, just as I know when I'm liking a video on YouTube or filling out a census form. But I'm also contributing information to data sets unintentionally all the time. I don't intend to create a log of my location every time I open a Google product on my phone, but I do. I don't know when my keystrokes are being automatically logged on a web form or that if my IP address is being logged when I watch Netflix, but these data are nevertheless being automatically created. So I suggest that researchers think about the data that they're using and where on this chart that I'm showing they might fall. Broadcasts are public data that were intended to be so by the person that they pertain to. So I know when I'm tweeting and I want it to be public to other people, I'm sending it out to an audience. And there are shades of gray here. I might post something to a Reddit health forum, which is quite public. I know that there's a public there, but I assume that will stay within that disclosure context and not appear in a high-profile paper in Nature. Next is secrets. Secrets are private, but I know that I'm creating them, and I usually have a pretty firm set of expectations about the circumstances under which they'll be kept secret. When I tell my doctor something, they may enter it into a health record, but I know that that record is supposed to be kept confidential within the medical system. Similarly, if I participate in a health research app that sends me daily update or ecological momentary assessments or questions about sort of how I'm doing in the moment, I both understand that I'm creating that data, and I presume it's going to be kept confidential among study researchers. Exhaust data are available and created in public, but it's generated without me necessarily taking an action. So traffic data that includes a count of my car, CCTV camera footage, a satellite photo of my house, these are all exhaust data. In health research, we might think about social contact traces provided by cell networks as exhaust data. So there are many kinds that might be exhaust. Finally, espionage data is created without my action or intention and is created in more private settings, frequently without my knowledge. So this might include the telemetry data that is recorded by my phone or other sensor data taken from my phone. It might include a piece of malware that's collecting keystroke data from private text messages. And there are shades of gray for all of these kinds of data. The thing about spectra, right, is that there's things in the middle. But like I said, thinking about where data come from, I think can help serve as a starting point for thinking about the ethical implications of data research and data reuse. Just because data comes from one box doesn't make it completely ethical to use or completely unethical to use if it comes from another box. Each box has its own set of implications. The first of these have to do with informed consent. Just because someone posted something intentionally doesn't mean that they were consenting to use it for a research project or to train an algorithm. So we can ask as researchers, how do the terms of service or other agreements users might have made affect whether it's permissible to use that data for a research project? Are there norms on the site that we're collecting from or even within subcommunities on that site for sharing or reusing data? And we can also ask what objections people might have for their data being used or reused in a project, as well as whether it's feasible at all to obtain their consent as part of that research. And similarly, public data can have implications for privacy. When someone may have while someone may have shared, for example, their mental health status on Twitter, where they're part of a community who follow each other, having their mental health status shared in a research paper might be a totally different matter for their privacy. And even if data is delinked from a personal identity, it can be used to re-identify people and reveal things about them that they might not want shared. Geolocation data, for example, from phones can be used to follow someone from a public event, like a protest, to their home. And data that has been purposefully anonymized to hide who it is connected to can be de-anonymized, as numerous studies have shown. So researchers need to be thinking about each of these. Oh, I'm so sorry. This slide continually has this problem of putting white. I saved it yesterday and it looked fine. And here it is. You cannot read it. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure what's up with this slide. It's given me problems before. So now you cannot see this, but I'll make sure that the organizers have a version that has the questions I'm about to say out loud on it so that you can have them. But the second principle that I want to highlight today for ethical data reuse inspired by ethnography is reflecting on power. Thinking about data sources, as we were doing when we were thinking about awareness, can also help think about the principle of justice. Do data come from particularly vulnerable populations? Are the data we're using more likely to produce errors when it's applied to a population that has historically been harmed by such errors? Does the data we're using help a less vulnerable population, perhaps at the expense of a more vulnerable population? And does the research design include members of the population group that it's targeted at helping? Particularly in the US, but also in non-US contexts, data-driven technical developments have been designed for the targeted oppression of minorities and have failed to live up to liberatory promises. AI researchers and practitioners need to consider these power relations. We need to consider whether it was appropriate to make a given community or population more vulnerable by creating new forms of data or by secondary uses of their data. So this consideration, figuring these questions out, might involve spending time, virtually or physically, in a community to understand their norms, collaborating with a community to serve their needs, or speaking to gatekeepers to understand specific harms. For example, the harms of amplifying content beyond its originally intended audience. Pervasive data research should emphasize the standard drawn from political representation movements and disability activism. No research about us without us. Using pervasive data to study populations or to make automated decisions about them without significant representation from those groups risks erasing the standpoints and lived experiences of the people behind that data. And just as in ethnography, there's an argument for using data science to study up, for turning data science and automated decision-making on people with significant social or political power, health systems, insurance companies, for whom public accountability is important. Of course, understanding power and imbalances of power is a really complex process. There are people who spend whole academic careers understanding these things. And we realize that doing such a reflection within data science and AI projects is a big ask. However, the good news is there are numerous helpful frameworks for thinking through issues of power adapted specifically for diverse and varied forms of digital data use, including feminism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and queer theory. For example, the excellent book Data Feminism explains principles for approaching data use from a feminist lens. And attention to power in situated forms of data use continues to grow. For example, in the HCI space, there's been work on treatment and thinking about how to do decolonial digital mental health. And so this paper here that I've highlighted outlines approaches for addressing power in digital mental health research. So frameworks like these can provide really concrete guidance to researchers or practitioners who are considering how their work might unevenly subject participants to increased vulnerability. So, if the answer to is data use or collection ethical is always it depends, how do we help data users and system builders walk through how variables that matter, like awareness and power, impact their individual projects? To meet this challenge and to hopefully be helpful to diverse data use communities, we're designing and testing what we're calling the Pervade Decision Support Tool. We maybe need a better name for this. If folks have ideas, I'm all ears. The vision is for this tool is as a resource. This is not a governance tool. This is a tool that will recommend actions and videos and readings. And we see it as a supplement to other research ethics education efforts, courses, online trainings, things like that. This tool is openly available on the Pervade website, and I provided a link at the end. And I'm going to show you a bit about how we're envisioning its use and features. What the tool is meant to encourage is project design for trust or trustworthy data use. It walks users through reflexivity about every part of their project design, prompting places where users might increase their engagement with awareness and power. For example, in its opening section on project goals, the tool uses quiz questions to ask users to consider whose interests are represented in their project and whether there are existing disciplinary or codified guidelines that they might draw from. We ask questions about power and representation, prompting users to consider whether they're studying up or down or neither, and how they might increase representation on their project teams. We delve into contextual expectations embedded in data sources using the data quadrants concept that I introduced earlier, as well as discussions about how data was acquired and the norms of the collection context. And you can see here what participants, as they answer questions, they get feedback on each question. We discuss security and retention best practices. We discuss the challenges of analysis, including challenges of constructing meaningful binaries and hierarchies from data, linking data sets, and making potentially distressing or harmful inferences about data subjects, or even populations beyond the data subjects themselves. And finally, we close with questions about data sharing, including pointing out challenges around de-identification of data and balancing open science principles with participant protection. So while taking the questionnaires you saw before, users get per question feedback. And then when they've finished using the tool, they also get a prescription based on all of their answers for next steps that they can take to work through the data ethics issues that they've encountered. Users may find themselves operating in easy mode, intermediate mode, or hard mode, with more or less work to do to work through ethical issues, depending on the details of their research plan and their data use. Hard mode users are not being told not to do their project, just that they have more work to do to ensure participant awareness and to reflect upon power. So our tool is designed for researchers and for developers, and we hope it will support them not only in their own projects, but provide experience to lead reflection on awareness and power with their collaborators. It's kind of scaffolding this process that if you worked with me on a project, I might walk you through, and that hopefully with the idea that you might be the person to lead that reflection on your next research project. And the Brevate team has been conducting interviews with data scientists as sort of part of this to focus on how they are already navigating issues of awareness and power in their research. And while we're still analyzing the results of those interviews, a spoiler alert for an emerging finding is that data scientists are already successfully grappling with these issues, and their practices for navigating them tend to look a lot like those of qualitative researchers. We've heard numerous stories of researchers spending time in the communities they're studying to learn the nuances of how data is shared and the expectation of participants. For example, telling students that they're not allowed to harvest data about gameplay in a digital game until they've played for 100 hours themselves. We've heard stories of researchers thinking critically about whether and how they should perform research on vulnerable populations and striving towards more participatory forms of big data research. We've heard examples of writing positionality statements, which are really common in qualitative work in data science publications. And we've heard stories of turning the substantial tools of data science onto structures of power rather than onto individual people. So using pervasive data to study political campaigns or advertisers or the platforms themselves. We also hope that professional organizations will establish professional norms and codes for trustworthy AI, as anthropologists and sociologists have done. This could consist of setting up clear guidelines or procedures to follow, but it can also consist of peer modeling for each other what trustworthy practices are, peer checking of research or development methodologies in the design phase, and publishing methodological reflections on trustworthy development practices in professional trade journals. Paper reviews, frequently run by professional organizations, are another area where we can build mechanisms for AI ethics into the structures we already rely upon for trust in research more generally. Reviewers can expect and prompt authors for reflections on the whys and hows of awareness and power. And this is already happening formally and informally in places like ACM SIGCHI, which is the primary human-computer interaction community, which has a research ethics committee to help advise reviewers when they run into research ethics issues, and NeurIPS, which is a machine learning conference, which requires, quote, authors to put their work in context and reflect on potential harms as well as appropriate uses of human data sets. Going forward, digital device users are already quite vulnerable as their traces are turned into data by researchers, corporations, and governments. We hope that AI researchers and developers will embrace reflections on how to decrease this vulnerability and will hold each other to higher ethical standards, particularly with respect to openness with research subjects and reflexivity on power and impact. For many of us across disciplines, reflections on awareness and power are not necessarily required by current IRB processes or workplace regulations. But within traditions such as ethnographic research, reflections have become bound up with definitions of and norms for ethical research, good methods, and good practice. Through design for such reflections, technologists, researchers, and the organizations that support pervasive data use can all contribute to a more trustworthy AI development community. So though I focused today on ethical data use as sort of one important component of trustworthy AI design, I want to finish by highlighting that there are a number of other issues that we should and could be thinking about when it comes to trustworthy AI development. There is lots of room for innovation in the space of design practices to support trustworthy development of AI. This is a major motivation and research goal for the new NSF Institute for Trustworthy AI in Law and Society, or TRAILS, which is a partnership between the University of Maryland, where I'm based, George Washington University, and Morgan State University. And I'm excited to say that we've just launched this institute just months ago. And we are planning to have projects focused on more participatory techniques for the design of AI, for developing methods and metrics to represent the interests of diverse stakeholders in AI development, for evaluating trust, and for increasing participation in AI governance. And so this is something we're really excited about going forward, sort of stay tuned, but also things that we're excited to collaborate around. And so as data science and as AI development both move towards more participatory forms of research, we hope that the Institute can support that. So I will end here with my project website and email address, and in case you'd like to follow up, and I would love to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shilton. This was great. Folks, you can feel free to ask questions in the chat. You can just raise your hand and we'll call on you in Zoom.
Jonathan, do you want me to leave the slide up, or should I take it down so that you and I will be larger on the screen?
Yeah, let's take it down. We can always reshare if folks want to see something specific, but this will give us a chance to see everybody's faces if they want to ask questions. So yeah, again, you can ask questions in the chat. You can raise your hands. I've got two types of questions, Katie, that I was kind of mapping out that I could imagine. I'm sure folks are going to have sort of conceptual clarification questions, but then there's also the bigger picture policy and practice questions. So I've got a few of those I can work through with you, but I see Dr. Cash has his hand up. So Mason, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just, hi, I was just wondering sort of test case. I mean, how does the Pervade system itself looks like a data collection, a lot of users giving data and so on. How are you putting these principles into practice in that system? Might be a nice way to sort of give us an illustrative example. I'm assuming you are doing that. How does it work in a system like that? We have a lot of people trusting your system, giving you data about how they're conducting their studies. Are you able to be a participant in that, in all of those fields and quite the way you're suggesting there?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I will say that we are using the backend we are using is Qualtrics, which is a data collection platform that some of you or all of you may be familiar with. It's frequently used for survey research, and it's a commercial product. And we're doing that because none of us wanted to roll our own backend. And we have a contract. Maryland has a contract with Qualtrics that protects the privacy of that data. That said, we are also at the moment not using it for research purposes. We're not actually recording any of it. And so we're just like regularly deleting the database because we just want people to use it without feeling observed. Well, right now I am in talks with a couple of data science nonprofits to move the system out of Qualtrics and into a backend that they use, but it of course would still have the same issues, right? Of potential data collection. Anytime you have an online tool, you've got potential data collection. Yeah, we're really just being very clear right now with the messaging that this is a tool for you to use, and we are actually not studying how it's being used. Now, eventually that will need to change, right? If we partner with an organization, they're going to want to know, even just for usability, right? How it's being used. Are people stopping halfway through, right? All of these things you sort of want to know if your system works well. And transparency and consent are going to be the sort of principles that we use. I mean, we're lucky in that this is a form of pervasive data that is lends itself to consent very easily, to traditional forms of informed consent, and actually traditional IRB protections fairly easily, because people know they're creating it, and you can tell them, who you are, why you want the data, what you're going to do with the data. You can email them the results afterwards. That said, we do want, if and when we get into that situation where we're starting to analyze, because you could imagine that if this was really successful, you could analyze data science as a whole and how they're answering these questions, and that would be really useful. We would want leaders from data science conferences consulting with us on sort of how we create that study, right? And how we, what we want to know and how we use that data, how we anonymize it, all of those principles. So yeah, I think, we really have to be careful to walk our own walk. So we've thought about awareness, but we need to think about power next when we get into that research stage.
And if I could just add a quick follow-up, I mean, it seems like you're dealing with, in that kind of context, a bunch of people thinking about using data, wanting to do it responsibly, discovering that they're not, discovering that they've got some glaring power imbalances they're not addressing, things like that. How do you feel about your obligations to nudge, help, insist that people pay attention to those things you've revealed that they are not? I mean, is it okay if people sort of take the study, find out they're being horribly awful in terms of privacy or power imbalances or whatever, and then just, okay, we'll be okay with that. Thank you for letting us know.
Right, now we know. Cool.
You have some obligation to be able to follow up with the people
Right.
who might be revealing these awful things that you need to, hang on, maybe somebody needs to know that these people are conducting research in that way. That's kind of, they understand it's creepy now and they're still doing it.
Right. We have not thought about enforcement or teeth at all. Partially because we are like, who are we, right? Like we're a group of researchers,
I'm
not
thinking
an
about like
IRB.
responsibilities though. I mean, do
That's
you have a
right,
responsibility
yeah.
to try to suggest or nudge or something?
Yeah, beyond sort of providing resources, I think, that's the from our standpoint where we sit, that like providing resources, being educators that is the nudge that we feel is appropriate for our sort of power position, right? And because nobody has put us in charge of data ethics, right? Like we are empirical researchers. And so, but that said, I've given this version of this talk to IRBs who do have regulatory power and who definitely have also regulatory responsibility, right? Like they are institutionally responsible for, making sure. Well, they have two sort of competing. They are, they need to follow the common rule, but also they kind of would like to keep you off of the front page of the New York Times for ethical data misuses, right? So IRB members are the people who have sort of said to me, like, we want better guidance, we want more guidance. It's not coming from the common rule, but we can advise, they are in positions where they can be advocates for particular kinds of, research ethics. And so that is, I think, the place where I would sort of feel, I do feel comfortable saying, we built this tool, it's based on our studies of sort of what this field needs. Do with it what you will, right? Like if this is useful to you, you are the ones with the authority here. Similarly with like the other places in the sort of ecosystem, research ethics ecosystem that have teeth of some sort are conference reviews. And they can be controversial. It's a controversial place to do it, partially because the harm is frequently already done by the time reviewers. This is why IRBs, love them or not, have some advantages because they are seeing research early. They're seeing proposals for research as opposed to conference committees who are saying, and then I collected all this data about all these people and, maybe the paper doesn't get published, but you've already done that work. That said, they are real norm setters, right? Because if work's not getting published, that has particular ethical problems with it, word gets around, and communities do rise to that occasion. So I think that conference review committees, some of which I am part of, right? That's where I feel appropriate using my power, is to say, like, look, this is coming from empirical work. I feel comfortable saying I don't think this paper should be published in this community, right? Like here are our standards here. So when communities have sort of had that conversation, then I do feel much more comfortable using my regulatory authority.
Katie, the conversation that you and Mason are having are stimulating all kinds of questions. So we've got three that I'm going to have Shahid ask you a question in just 1 second, but you've actually got a question from an IRB member here at UCF just about that, like practically speaking, what kind of questions could IRB members ask to sort of help support and review this type of research? So you might address that quickly, and then I'm going to ask Shahid to ask his question, and then Lisa will be up next.
Yeah. So I think a lot of them are embedded in the tool, but really asking people, like, where did your data set come from? And do you have ideas about, people's perceptions, expectations, or norms around reuses of that data? And, sometimes that answer will be easy. People say, yeah, it comes from political Twitter, which is all about publicity. And like, I feel very comfortable saying people would be fine with us using it. And sometimes people say, oh, I haven't thought about that, right? Like, where does this data, like, are there expectations of norm in the place that this data comes from? It's just data, right? So that, I think that's like one of the critical first questions to ask researchers who are doing pervasive data research that, doesn't fall under traditional IRB protections, but is giving you pause for some reason, right? Like, it's to ask them questions about that pause, right? That you are having, because I think lots and lots of folks, IRB folks I've talked to, are sort of running up against this issue where researchers are coming to them with data warehouse, like harvesting ideas that make them quite uncomfortable, but aren't necessarily that's reuses, secondary uses of data that are technically allowed. And so then what? So how do we help the researchers sort of pause? And I think our tool is one way we're hoping to do that. But yes, with your authority, I would ask, like, where's the data coming from? What are the norms? And then, to start to gently probe their positionality as researchers. Like, have you talked to members of this community about this research? How are they represented on your team? And it's tricky because you're and so one good thing about being who I am, which is a person with no regulatory authority, is like I can ask people all these questions all I want. And every time I go on a conference, to a conference, I ask people these questions from the audience. It's trickier if you're an IRB member because you are an authority, right? And you have the power to stop research in a way that I don't, except for on conference review committees, as I talked about earlier. So I think you do have to be pretty sensitive to that. That like, and as an IRB, decide where you're going to. And I think different universities have sort of come down different places about how much they're going to push on researchers or push back on researchers doing pervasive data research that might have injustices embedded in it. But asking. I do think it's appropriate to ask researchers to be reflective about that, either in their methods or when they write up the paper. And I think hopefully, I'll point you to the tool and like I would, go through it and see if there are questions you can just like grab for yourself to ask people that might be helpful, like some wording that might be useful. We spent a lot of time trying to make the questions interesting and evocative without being without putting people on the defensive, right? About their research. I don't know how successful. That's one thing we need to do in our user testing when we eventually do it is, right, do people just walk away at some point because they're like, who are you? Like, stop, right? We don't want to make people defensive. So it's a tricky line to walk.
I would doubt that's going to happen because I think so many of us in our organizations are asking these same sorts of questions. So
I hope I think and hope that's true. And my experience giving talks like this has universally been that people are like, no, we want to do this well. We're just sort of struggling with what that looks like, right? And that's why I love talking to academics. It's a much easier pitch than in Silicon Valley.
Katie, we have a question from Shahid for you about responsibility and its locus. That's very interesting. So Shahid, if you're still with us, do you want to ask that question?
Yeah.
And then Lisa, you up next.
Thank you, Jonathan.
My pleasure.
So this is Shahid. My question is, let me give you the context first. So recently I discovered that platforms such as Venmo, they share information about your financial transactions. What did you purchase from whom? Who did you send money? Where did you receive from? Pretty much all the information regarding your financial transaction with pretty much everybody. Now, this can be extended to a wide variety of platforms and wide variety of types of transactions. That basically means they are collecting and sharing information with or without adequate consent. Now, my question is, should it be the responsibility of the individual not to share such data or such information on such platforms? Or should it be the responsibility of the social media platforms such as Venmo or Twitter or eBay, whoever it is, not to collect the data irresponsibly or not to share it without consent? Or should it be the responsibility of a researcher who might think it's all public data and let's just collect and run regressions with them?
This is a great question. So I have, some easy answers and then some not so easy answers. The easy answer is I don't think it should be users' responsibility. That sort of everybody has to take care of their own data hygiene in this world. I mean, it's just never going to work. And also, why should individuals have to be responsible for this very complex set of decision making about when to give data and when not to? And they don't get access to these tools. It's not a real choice, right, to use or not use these tools. If you need to pay your babysitter and they only use Venmo, Venmo it is, right? And so there are not other good options that are, and there are a few, like, yes, there's better, you can use Signal for text messaging, right? That has better data privacy rules. There are a few options out there for some products, but as we know, right, payment platforms, there isn't the Signal of payment platforms right now that I know of, right? So I don't think this should be up to consumers. So then there are sort of two branches to this question. One is, what should companies be doing? And that is going to take legislation because companies are not just going to do this out of the interest of they're not going to solve surveillance capitalism out of and they are dependent on it to make money. So that is like a separate talk I could give. And I'm not even the best person to get. I have a PhD student who worked on Capitol Hill for years and could talk about why privacy legislation is stalled and what is happening in that space. It's fascinating. That's a hard political problem that needs to be solved, a policy problem. Although, there's movement. Things like GDPR are starting to, that's the European Union's data protection law, are starting to impact American companies because American companies have European users. And so we are starting to see some meaningful data protection legislation, maybe in the US as well. California has a privacy bill that's decent. So, we are starting to see some restrictions on data, just sort of mass data sharing. That's one piece. Then there's researchers, which you asked about. And so I think, and I sort of joked about this earlier with researchers being easier to talk to, but I will say that my work in this space started with a survey that my colleague Jessica Vitak and I did of social media researchers. And one of the questions we asked, this was 2014 or 15, right after the emotional contagion study. And one of the questions we asked was, should researchers be held to a higher data use standard than companies? And the answer was resoundingly yes. Researchers have a long tradition of data ethics for good reason, because of scandals and terrible things that we did with two people with data in the past. So researchers are holding themselves to a higher standard, I think, and I think that's a good thing. I think we don't have the market pressures. There are a lot of reasons that we can have a higher ethical bar for data sharing. So absolutely, researchers partnering with Venmo need to be asking themselves, should I be using this data that people may not understand is being used for research in these ways? And if so, are there meaningful ways I could get consent?
Yeah, thanks. Lisa,
Great, thank
please
you.
go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beaver, and thank you, Dr. Shilton. This was a fantastic presentation, and obviously these are issues that are swirling around the heads of lots of researchers these days. I wanted to get back to this question about harms, and particularly in that very public square of your quad graphic. Let me think of it, how to say this. IRBs are responsible for ensuring and protecting individual participants, not for protecting communities or further on effects, right? They're actually explicitly told don't be considering these bigger picture things, just what is the harm to that participant. And in your work, when you've talked to individuals, like, what are they perceiving as the harm done to them? Like, if I say something stupid on Twitter, what is the harm that using that stupid statement in a research study, what would be the additional harm than the harm I've already done to myself by saying it in the first place? So that's one question. The other piece is, because IRBs are explicitly prohibited from considering this idea of community harms or follow-on harms, what are your ideas about whether or how we should account for that as researchers, and not just in this big data space? I think it's much more common in this big data space, but there are often things that reviewers, IRBs, think, oh, this might have community harms or group harms, but that's not what we're supposed to be dealing with. Do you have any ideas about how to manage that? Because I think it's only going to grow with this idea of using these data. Thank you.
Yes. No, this is such a good question. So you really narrowed in on one place where our current research protection infrastructure just is a mismatch with the kinds of both data and data uses that we are seeing. And that includes both data science uses, creating new knowledge about communities, inferences that you never could have seen coming, right, based on big data, as well as harms around decision-making systems, right, and AI, because now you can not only try to predict something that you wouldn't have been able to predict without that level of data, but you can now have a machine that makes, consequential decisions based on that inference. And so that is, that these two paradigms together is something that is just, right, it just is outside of what was written into the common rule, even during the revision, right? I mean, which was done almost 10 years ago at this point, right? Or sort of undertaken, just because we weren't thinking about this, right? And it wasn't, there were folks who were, but it wasn't the loudest voice in the room. That's my understanding. I wasn't part of that discussion, but that's my understanding of what happened, is that thinking about secondary uses of data as potentially harmful was just not not in the dialogue at the time of the Common Rule revision. It is very much a part of the dialogue now. So yes, this is absolutely, people are really, when you talk to people about, so I have one of my doctoral students just did in-depth interviews with TikTok content creators. And so TikTok is a great example of an extremely public form of content delivery, right? Or content, people make TikTok videos in order for other people to see them. And there's an algorithm that tries, you're trying to go viral. And yet young people using TikTok have not particularly individual, some worries about individual harms, particularly around their audience. So, they're not wanting their boss or their, so context collapse is what we call this, right? They don't want their boss, or they don't want their conservative uncle or their liberal uncle to see their political views or whatever, right? Like they have some of those personal concerns, but their harm concerns really are about communities that they have established on TikTok. Because of the way the TikTok algorithm works, you sort of have your own feed, but it becomes a community of performers and viewers, and based on what you like. So there's, sea shanty TikTok or whatever. And so they have pretty nuanced worries about particular harms, particularly people who are engaged in communities that are marginal in some way. And whether, it's because they are young and they're discussing self-harm, or because it's a more what we think of as a traditionally marginalized community. They form these communities, very public, but still, like, these communities are about us. They are about us. They will be misunderstood if they're being studied by people from outside of the community. That's really the worry, is that their lived experience won't be represented properly. And that's such an ethnographic concern, right? Like, that's exactly the same concern that you see, the sort of harms that ethnographers bring to communities, is coming and saying, I see what's happening here, right? And like, no, that's not the experience of the people that you're studying. And it's because of your own standpoint that you missed it, right? So that's really like these sort of like group harms, or like harms to a community, or to the harm of misunderstanding or misrepresentation is, I think, what these young people are worried about. So we see that with TikTok, we see that with Twitter as well. Again, my colleague Casey Fiesler, who studied with her doc student, Black Twitter, a similar, like, a community that has formed in a public space but has a specific identity, and doesn't want that identity misrepresented. And so those kinds of representational harms. And then, of course, once we move into algorithms and starting to make predictions based on what information people are given based on the perceived communities that they are part of, those harms start to become much more about groups than individuals, and group harms. And that's just something, right, IRBs aren't enough to worry about. So this then moves it into, at least right now, for the moment, until we have legislation that can deal with this, moves it into the responsibility of researchers. Like, we need to be hyper aware of potential harms to communities or harms to groups, the harms of amplification of content beyond where it was intended to be shared, those kinds of harms. And they're hard to predict. They are new. That's something, one of the debates in the machine learning community has been, how much work do we need to do to try to perceive future harms of our systems, right? And also, how do we get good at that? This sort of like future harms casting is a new skill even for ethicists, I think, and definitely for many computer scientists. So, coming up with activities to help people think about, well, okay, there are, particular forms, there are, particular forms of power that we can spot and talk about because we know historically they have been problems. Let's start there, right? But then, there's you can do Black Mirror Writer's Room, which is a sort of a design fiction activity where you think about, like, what's the worst thing that could happen with your algorithm, right? With your data science study, right? What's the worst? Can you imagine and then what do you do to sort of mitigate that potential outcome? Or there are values, there are increasingly games that put different stakeholders and values on the table to help you think through groups you might not have thought of before, and their values and the ways that those might be challenged by your research or your system. So people are coming up with methods, but it's a wide open space.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. That was a really interesting. It's got my brain spinning. Katie, there's a whole set of questions that while you were responding, I was trying to get my head around that I think are related. I think the general worry that I'm seeing in the chat and in my own thinking is this: there might be some like contraindications to the ethnography analogy.
Yeah.
In the sense that digital data, is so pliable, it's so greased, right? It changes over time. There's concerns about re-identification across different data types. There's the transitivity of public and private data. There's this whole landscape about secondary use, secondary consent and reconsent models. I think the worry is like, generally speaking, are those problems insurmountable? Is there something about digital data that should make us really pause in our technological development, in our research? Because even as researchers who are bound in a particularly nuanced way by research ethics, the data we use and the way it's going to be used in the future is a little slippery, right? So we don't have as much control as maybe I'd like us to have over where that data is headed. So I wonder if you could just speak generally about that concern, about the ways that it might not be quite like ethnography.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point. The reshareability, the reusability of all of this is something that is completely different, right? In fact, famously, it is difficult to reuse ethnographic data, and that kind of stops with you or the research instrument, right, as the ethnographer, and that it stops with you, and that is not true and not accounted for in this analogy of digital data, where, right, you may be conducting a study with, all of the appropriate representation from that community. Might be a completely participatory study, and then you create this data, and then it is reusable for something else, right, that you may not be able to anticipate. Yeah, this is this is something that machine learning developers worry about a lot too, right? You create a chat bot for one that is tuned very carefully to do one thing, but it will change over time. It also can be, if you make your code open, which you probably should, because that's really good practice, then it can be used for misinformation campaigns. Like, yes, this easy reusability and malleability problem is not one that I have an easy solution to. I really relies on, I gave a talk recently to a group of funders, government funders were thinking about misinformation. And I was saying that it was a weird talk to give because, as a sort of, from my information ethics hat, I spent a lot of time assuming good intent, right? And assuming that people want to do things well, and but we are just missing the guidelines. And so, with researchers, I think it's pretty easy to be like, don't pause and let's think about these reuses of data. Maybe don't do it if these 3 things are true or whatever. But I think we have to face that even creating a data set and sharing it, which is good open science principles, we know that there are bad actors out there with information, or just actors with really different views of the world or power relationships than I have, right? And so then what, right? And I don't have an answer to this. This is like a deep philosophical problem that maybe somebody here has an answer. I don't know how we live in a world where we can provide these really malleable resources for other people, and then we kind of, or we are okay with letting them go. And yet that is how science works, right? We to some degree we put it out there, and we hope that people aren't going to use our systems to trick elders into giving, I think a lot about the people who develop voice recognition algorithms, right, who are doing it for folks who with disabilities who want their be able to speak in their older voice again, or there are such good reasons to develop these technologies, and then they are absolutely used for scams. And I don't have an answer to how to prevent that, or what we do, except for a world where there's less precarity, and so people don't need to scam each other as much. Sometimes I feel like we're solving the wrong problems here in the tech world, right? And in the data ethics world. And then actually, if we just had a world with less precarity, then we would have fewer scams, and we could worry less about bad actors. Maybe that's the answer.
I will say, Katie, I really appreciate, there's a sense in which your response is comes with a lot of optimism and positivity. And I think I find that really valuable. I will admit, and folks who know me know this, that I tend to take the other option. I worry a lot in my own work about the bad actors, because it's kind of the Apple metaphor, right? It only takes one before the whole batch is ruined. And there's been a whole history of that in research and data science too. On the other hand, the optimism seems really encouraging, and I like the idea that through work like yours, we're building up this sense that there's an individual responsibility to do good work, right? And if we could just inculturate that across our ecosystems, whether that's research or private industry, we could not worry so much. And
Right.
I
Right.
struggle
With
that
the,
a lot,
the
sort of.
caveat that that's easy to say when you are, a tenured faculty member at a
Yeah.
position, in a position that pays well. And like, there's so much of my own power that comes into that optimism, right? Like, and so, yeah, I think it's just really important to acknowledge that we are not headed on a trajectory where this is going to be easy, right? As income disparity increases, like it is only going to be more attractive to use this stuff to survive. And so then what, right? So yeah, then what?
Yeah. Anna, you asked a question in the chat that I'll just read unless you'd like to ask it live. But you say, have you thought, Katie, about or worked on data annotation practices in ethics? For example, data for abusive language or emotion detection to better predict, I guess.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So annotation. I think that data annotation. Okay. So and I'm seeing like two things in this question. So first of all, data annotation is going to be one of the most important things for sort of trustworthy machine learning going forward. It's a practice that has to be done well and has to exist both so that these systems can work, but also so that this idea of context, which I've been building around, the data is from a context, and then if it's being reused, that context needs to go with it in some way, right? So that people reusing that data understand how it was collected and from who it was collected, and that context is what a lot of what is getting erased right now in both data science and machine learning, right? Where there's a data set and like, this seems like good for my purpose, I'm going to use it, and that context doesn't ride along with it. So there are these really, really excellent efforts right now around things like data sheets for data sets and model cards, which try to document some of this and annotate some of this context. And, and I think those are really, really important. We also know from science studies, which is like a sister discipline to where I've been hanging out in the science and technology studies, that annotation is really challenging, and data documentation is extremely challenging. So in the sciences and open science initiatives, scientists, it's not work they want to do. It's work you need to pay somebody to do. It needs to be somebody's job. And then this question comes of whose job, and is it a good job, right? And then B, what is that process like? And so so then the second part of your question, Anna, focuses on really difficult data to document, right? And this is true in, we see this a lot in machine learning. Data annotation is a critical part of making these systems work. And the work of doing that annotation is done by poorly paid contractors overseas, and it is terrible work, right? It is really, 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 really challenging because there's so much, if you're using Reddit to train your algorithm, there's a lot on Reddit that people shouldn't have to wade through, right? And Reddit is like a fairly clean example, actually, of the internet, as these things go. So there's the ethics of this work. So, Mary Gray's work on ghost work is just so important here, like really pointing out that all of this stuff is human labor, right? None of these machines are automated. Actually, I mean, there's automatic stuff that happens at some point, right? And like the learning is automated, but the annotation is not. It is super, super human, and it is a job. And so who are we going to value to do this? Who are we going to pay to do this? And what does that look like is, I think, another justice question that's like a little bit outside of the scope of it's very much outside the scope of how we've thought about data ethics in the past, right? Like IRBs are not. In fact, IRBs sometimes go the other way on data annotation. Like you might be paying too much and it's manipulative, right? If you're using Amazon Turk workers, for instance, to label your data. And that's fair. Like that, I understand why that's happening because of the sort of history of research ethics. But again, this is another place I didn't even really touch on it, where the labor of who is doing this work is super, super important. And we don't have really concrete ethical norms for what it should look like for researchers, what we should be paying, who we should be asking to do this work. Like, do we ask our graduate students to do this? Do we do it? Whose work is this? Wide open question that needs some norms.
Ellen asked a question that maybe I want to direct us to bigger picture, and that is, from your place of expertise, Katie, what do you think about the future of regulation, public and private? So nation states, as well as public entities, including OpenAI, have all called for regulation of these emerging technologies. And from your perspective, what does the future of that look like?
I'm going to first say that all of my insights into regulation come straight from my doctoral student, Anna Leonard. So I want to just acknowledge her. She was a Hill staffer. She is doing research in this area now. She is really an advocate for, and I agree with her, that we have regulatory tools that can deal with AI for the exact reason of that sort of I've been talking through today, which is that AI is data, partially. It is very much data and also labor. But the data piece, we have been working on legislation for a long time, actually, to deal with, and that privacy legislation and then copyright is going to be the other sort of piece of the other lever that we've got for regulating these technologies going forward. So we've got privacy, we've got copyright. Now, copyright legislation in the U.S. is currently at the federal level has stalled. There are some pretty complex fights going on between state of California senators and a bipartisan agreement elsewhere because California already has privacy legislation that they want to take precedent. So, and then there's a larger problem of congressional challenges of getting anything through Congress at the moment. So there's a lot of sort of challenges riding. And so I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing efforts right now around like AI being new and we need all new things, is because the existing levers we have are kind of stalled out. I think that's too bad, because I would like to see the existing levers we have sort of pushed forward. Let's see, what was the last piece I wanted to, oh, that's it. Okay, so that's the sort of data piece. Like, I think we have ways to address the data piece. We have ways to address sort of the ownership, intellectual property mushiness that starts to happen with generative AI, although that's going to get fought out in the courts, which really not an expert in, so I'll leave that. What we don't sort of have good regulatory norms around right now are labor issues in and sort of resources, thinking about this as like a resource problem, whose data and the resources that are used to design these systems, who benefits from them, like those sorts of things. I think we probably do need legislative thinking on, but I think we can get a long way with privacy plus copyright. That said, I will say, like, most of the privacy law that's out there right now has big carve outs for quote unquote public data. And a lot of what I've been talking about today actually would fall into those carve outs, so wouldn't be protected under sort of national privacy legislation. The financial records that we were talking about earlier probably would be, but like almost no social media data would be. There's interesting discussions right now about how much of this data should be made available to researchers specifically as part of transparency efforts for platforms. So researchers would love to be able to study platforms, which that's studying up, right? Like, good, yes, I'm all for that. But I do understand that users, may not realize that all of their data is being, like they're setting up a CERN for social media data, so, CERN, a big research center, right, where people could access all of this data. Users may not totally understand that that's happening. In fact, when they try to put tweets into the Library of Congress 15 years ago, people were pretty upset about that, right? Like, the government is going to archive all of our tweets. And so, I do think we need to think hard about those carve outs and how appropriate they are and what they're used for and how we authorize people to get access to massive troves of social media data in the name of research. So there are hard legislative things ahead of us beyond like just the challenge of trying to have any privacy legislation at all. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about in that space.
Yeah, it feels like that's the short answer to this landscape right now. There's so much to talk about. And we're so grateful for you joining us. Stephen, I see your hand. Go ahead, please.
Yes, wonderful talk. Thank you very much for being here. A few years ago, I think it was under Governor Scott, he decided that he was going to post the salaries of all the university professors.
Yeah.
And I think it was done politically, maybe for bargaining, to tell people, hey, they're getting paid too much, whatever. And I don't know how legitimate that was. I guess because they're public, on taxpayer roll, that they can do that. I wonder if anything's changed on that situation. And in fact, this state has become so unbelievably polarized. I noticed, and forgive me for asking this, you posted by your name, she, her, and hers. So that's digital. You kind of leaking out the fact that you're probably liberal, probably progressive.
Yeah.
You might not intend for that, but I cannot imagine a conservative doing that. So this kind of thing, yeah. In this state, I don't know. It's just weird.
No, this is a great. So this is really interesting. I mean, I actually kept thinking about this as I was giving my talk, because this is the first time I've given a talk in Florida, and I was thinking, like, as I went through. Right. I make a lot of assumptions about my audience because I work in academia, because I work in ethics in academia, right? It's like a very specific, and because I come out of this tradition of ethnography, which has grappled with very particular ways of thinking about power, and yeah, all of these things. Yep. And then I signal them in loud digital ways, right, all the time. Yeah, from where I sit in Maryland, it's like it's just, yeah, it feels very different, right? Yeah, I don't know, I don't know how to think about this or what to think about it, particularly like how, right? But because you're right, these digital traces, like, I mean, so this all goes back to this point I was making earlier, that like sometimes I feel like in the privacy and ethics world, that we're working on one piece of a larger of a problem that's actually just like a very large political problem. Like privacy is interesting because it's a relatively bipartisan issue, although the reasons that people are interested in it are different. But like ADPA, this privacy bill that made its way through the House but got stalled out in the Senate, had a bipartisan majority behind it. But privacy is trying to solve, it's like one way of trying to solve a larger sort of social problem around precarity and like what people can do to us with our data, right? And sometimes I feel like we're trying to, like, if we had now from where I sit, I think if we had a stronger social safety net, maybe I wouldn't have to worry as much about how people's data is going to be used, for instance, in healthcare decision making, right? That if people couldn't be denied benefits, then we wouldn't mind so much if people's data was used to make decisions in healthcare. But as soon as you have precarity introduced into the situation, but that's my worldview, right? And I don't know how to talk about why we need privacy and ethics without gesturing towards those sort of like to try to protect people from things that I think are dangerous, right? But like I don't know that everybody
I know that was a tough question. I apologize.
Yeah, no, but this is I think this is such an interesting.
I do have a quick follow-up though. Since you mentioned healthcare, medical, I did sign up for 23andMe a while back. I did the mouth swab. I submitted my information, and they did say that we will not share your genetic data with employers, insurance companies, public databases, or third-party marketers without your explicit consent. The only thing, if I give my consent, I don't really know where that's going. I don't think they're going to send me another email saying, oh, well, it went here and there and so on. So even then, you give your consent, boy, it's off in the twilight zone and you just don't know.
That's right.
Where it's going to end
that secondary use and the third use, the tertiary, yes, and it will get resold and packaged and right once it's sort of out of the gate. Yeah. No, I think that is the kind of long-term, we need legislative thinking around like, is there some end at which data and we're trying to balance new knowledge against privacy, which is a really hard trade-off, right? Where we're new knowledge and also money and sales and all kinds of things that we want against this sort of idea of harm and how to balance those properly, how to say, all right, this we cannot resell this data. I think it's a really hard set of decisions to make in the commercial sector, which is why I kind of stay out of the commercial sector.
Well, thanks again. Appreciate you.
Yeah. Oh, such interesting questions.
Katie, thank you so much. Before I turn things back over to Steve, I want to point out to everybody that I'm really grateful for these communities because we've got representation here today from faculty, staff, students, administrators, alumni, like IRB experts, ethicists, philosophers from UCF and beyond. I mean, it's incredible to me, and I'm always really grateful for everybody and for the conversation, and Katie and Steve for facilitating it. So thank you. Steve, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shilton, for sharing your insights on data privacy, especially in this age of AI. Thank you, Dr. Beaver, for your expert moderating of our event, as always. And thank you, participants, for great questions once again. I think I learned as much from the questions as I do from the presentations themselves. And we're very grateful, as Dr. Beaver said, for your involvement. A link to this presentation will be made available on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can view the recording again and you can share it with others. And there you'll also find links to past talks and information on upcoming presentations in Ethically Speaking. So here's what's coming up next in our series. Hopefully you can see the screen pop up. So the Earth's animal populations have declined by an amazing average of 69% since 1970. And that's partly due to unsustainable use of resources and resulting climate change. And at the same time, we've advanced our technologies by using animals, often without regard or little regard for their intrinsic value. Well, Dr. Rosalind Byrne argues that disregarding non-human animals also puts humans at risk, and the time is right for revisiting and revising animal ethics. Dr. Byrne is an extremely accomplished leader in the field of animal ethics, and she's going to join us to talk about this issue. She serves as Anne Shirley Carter Olson Professor of Applied Ethics and Chair of the Department of Engineering and Society at the University of Virginia. She's also the Director and Principal Investigator of the Online Ethics Center. And her presentation on animal ethics and revisiting this issue will actually be held in person at UCF, but we're also going to stream it live so that you can join remotely. And you'll be able to register and join remotely now by visiting the Center for Ethics website. And as always, I'll pester you with emails sending you out reminders about this upcoming event. I hope many of you can join us for Dr. Byrne's discussion of animal ethics. Ethically Speaking is made possible with support from the UCF Office of Research and Commercialization and the National Science Foundation. And I'd like to remind you of our inaugural partners and who they are. We really appreciate their helping us kick off this series from the very beginning, but it only continues because folks like you are joining and are so interested in the talks that we're having. So I'd like to thank you for your participation, and we hope you'll join us for future presentations in Ethically Speaking.